Does anyone here know much about ancient Near Eastern shepherd farming practices? Anybody? Okay, good. Well, it's a good thing I know something so I can share a little bit with you today about the background of that story that Will just read. Because a lot of people, they read that story that Will just read, and they read it as though Jesus is setting up boundaries and exclusivity, who's in, who's out. And that just doesn't sound like a Jesus that I'm familiar with. I'm familiar with a Jesus who welcomes. And so we're going to try to look at the farm, get the context of what he's talking about, who he's talking to. We're going to cut this up into 4 chapters. First, question for you. Who watches sheep? Shepherds. Okay. What age are shepherds? Like in your nativity scene, how old is a shepherd?
Boys.
They're supposed to be boys. If your nativity scene has like beards on them, then you've got the wrong shepherds there. Out in the fields, young boys, 8 to 13, maybe 14 if they're really irresponsible, would be the ones out in the fields watching the sheep. And if you were 15 or 16, that's when you started to come back to your home farm and learn the whole business. You would learn from dad or your boss about the business back on the home farm. And maybe by age 20, you've made enough money, you could start buying a couple of your own sheep, and then you could kind of watch them in with the sheep that you're paid to watch, and you'd raise them. And if you're doing a really good job raising those sheep and making more sheep, about 25, 30 years old, you're ready to just have your own flock and hire your another young boy from somewhere to watch it, and then you can trade a few sheep for a dowry, and you've got a wife, and all of a sudden everything's going right. That's the cycle of life in ancient Near Eastern farming. Got it? Got it. Okay, second chapter. Where did the shepherds care for the sheep? At home on the farm, they might have a corral, is a word we might use. Maybe it was, if they're poor and they only have a couple of them, they have a 2-story house. The first floor is just kind of a garage for sheep, and everyone lived on the second floor. If you were out in that corral, let's say they have the little bit more money, so they've got a whole corral. It's got little fences, mud, rocks, whatever it can, so the sheep can't get out. But they're not very high, so it would be really easy for someone to hop in, grab a sheep, take off. So part of a teenager's job was to stay out there and watch for any thieves, or your word was bandit in that. And they didn't have a hammock, they didn't have a rocking chair. What they did is they would sit in the gate. They didn't have swinging gates back then. It was just mud 350 degrees around or rocks, and then there was just a gap. And they would sit in that gap. So the shepherd was the gate. If the shepherd's sitting there, the gate's closed. If the shepherd's not there, the gate's open. Got it?
Right.
Okay, but what about the fields for the younger ones? You're getting the ordeal. This is like you get to respond, make sure we're all on the same page. Out in the field, for the most part, no one had private fields to bring their sheep. Same thing in America when America first started. Massachusetts, 1700, there was a commons, and everyone would bring their cows there, and they would graze together. So whether it's Boston or Nazareth, whether it's 1700s or 17 AD, all the boy shepherds would bring all their sheep out to this community field, and wherever grass they could find in the desert, and they would all just munch away together. And 5 or 10 young boys, it was their job all day, sometimes all night, just to make sure no sheep wandered off, no sheep fell down a cliff, no sheep got eaten by a wolf or a mountain lion. Got it?
Got it.
All right, that's the 3rd chapter. How do you keep a sheep safe? Well,
Is this a joke?
no, it would be a great joke. Sometimes I do tell really bad jokes. I feel like if I had a sheep joke in my head somewhere, it would go right. How do you keep a sheep safe? Well, in the corral, the teenagers watched. That was easy enough. But out in the fields, the young boys had 3 tools to keep a sheep safe. One was a rod, a staff, and a slingshot. A rod was used for 2 things only. If a sheep was going this way and you wanted to go this way, you kind of like nudge it that way. And if a mean coyote ever came to get that sheep, you would smack the coyote with your rod. And you would never use a rod to smack a sheep, which gives such a different meaning to the proverb, spare the rod and... Yeah, anyone who uses that to justify whacking a kid with a rod is just not able to read the Bible. It really is saying anyone who spares protection of their child is spoiling the child. Got it? Okay, what about the staff? The staff is that thing with a little hook on the end, right? And the hook was used for one thing, and that was scooping a sheep out of a dangerous place. Sheep falls in a stream, scoop it up. Sheep falls off a cliff, scoop it up. Bring it back, always for safety. Okay, so where have we heard rods and staffs? Does that sound familiar at all anywhere? Where in the Bible do we have rods and staffs? Yes, they comfort. They comfort you. Psalm 23, that's right. And who wrote Psalm 23? David. Okay, you guys this is trivia master here. We're doing great. Before David was writing poetry, before David was a king, he was a little boy, and I'm sure you've heard the story of little boy David slaying the giant Goliath. If you remember the story, the little details, David was the youngest brother, always the one picked on. And before we meet Goliath, all of the other brothers are recruited to go and fight in the battle, in the army. While David, his job is just to bring food and supplies to his brothers. He's just the go-between there. So if you read between the lines, what that means is all the older brothers are 13, 14, 15, and older. So they're old enough to fight, which means they're not in the fields anymore. They're back home learning the business of sheep farming. But David is not back home. He's always out with the sheep, so we know he's like 10 or 12 years old and not able to fight, not allowed to fight, which kind of makes sense, I guess. So David has his rod and his staff, and what else does he have?
Slingshot.
Slingshot. Wow, like that, right? You know he uses that with Goliath, but how in the world is that a shepherd's tool? Well, it's great to have a rod to smack a coyote, and wouldn't it be better if you had some way to scare coyotes off before they could steal the sheep? It's great to have a staff to scoop up a sheep that gets lost, but how great would it be if you had a tool to be able to keep the sheep closer? And that's what the little shepherd boys would do all day long. They'd pick up rocks and they'd swing them in front of the sheep's nose. If the sheep starts wandering over here, you'd throw a rock right in front of it and the sheep would turn around and run back. If the coyote was coming here, you'd throw a rock and smack that coyote right in the mouth. And so that's what the boys did. They were great at it. It's just like when I grew up, we would skip rocks. I could skip rocks just and count how many they could bounce, go as far as. They did the same thing with their little slingshots. They'd have little boy contests with their slingshots all the time. But his brothers, all the old brothers, they're out of practice. All they know what to do, they're big tough guys. What do big tough guys want to do? They want to be big and tough. And old David is over here with his little slingshot, so he swings it and he plunks Goliath right between the eyes, and he wins. No one expected a 10-year-old boy to have a chance versus such a giant, but shepherds had that kind of skill, which I think God is telling us a little thing about what we might be capable of in our world. But just for the shepherd thing, you got the slingshot, got it?
All right.
Okay, you know everything you need to know about ancient Near Eastern farming, so let's hear Jesus again in that context. And remember, over the last few weeks in this series, we've been focusing on that there's 7 times in the whole Bible where this one word gets emphasized. Jesus says it 7 times. In the passage Will read, 2 of those 7 times happen where Jesus emphasizes one word. He's like underlining it, bolding it. And if Jesus is underlining it, I want to pay attention. First he says, I am the gate. I am the gate. Remember the person's there watching, protecting? That's the gate. I am here so you can have life and have it abundantly. Don't be afraid. Even when things try to rob you of life, and all of us have things that try to rob us of life. All of us get distracted. Some of us have addictions. We have people in our lives who take up so much of our time and our patience and rob us of the ability to love in the world. And when all those things are trying to rob you of life, Jesus says, I am on your side. Not to hold you in, but to be here with you. And the thieves and the bandits are trying to take away fullness. Jesus is not some divine bouncer in this story, checking off whether you measure up, you're allowed to come in. Jesus is more of a holy security officer that guides and protects. Not a gate to check to see whether you belong here or not, but an open gate to lead you out into abundance. Got it?
Got it.
Then Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. What did David say about the good shepherd? Even though you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, fear no evil, for my rod and my staff, my protection, will be there to comfort you. And Jesus is talking in this story to little boys, to shepherds, 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 16-year-olds. And they are understanding. He's talking to them in terms they can understand. Well, the old businessmen and lawyers are over here kind of watching from the side, just waiting to trap Jesus in something. But he says to these boys who know everything there is to know about being a good shepherd, he said, obviously a good shepherd is there to care for the sheep. That's what I'm doing. That's what God's up to. And they thought, yeah, that makes sense. A God that's here to care. And that's not all. The good shepherd not only cares for one group of sheep, sure, but boys, young men, you know there will be other sheep. Their dreams are for a life with their own flock that hasn't been there yet, the sheep that are to come. So many people try to take this verse to create some exclusive club that says all the Christians in here are good and everyone out there not so good. But Jesus, he is pointing to flocks that are not even part of this, flocks that they're going to dream about in the future. It's people who are always doing the dividing and the separating, but that's not how sheep work, and it's not how shepherding works in those days. Sheep would mingle together. Shepherds would come together and graze together. The young men were always looking forward to to the future of life with sheep that weren't there. So when Jesus is telling this story, sure, God is taking care of God's chosen sheep. Easy. Everyone knows that. And he says, also, there's this radical message, I think it's radical, that God even cares for the sheep that we don't know about yet. The message that would have hit the deepest longings of their hearts, the little shepherd hearts, is that God is the kind of God that cares for people who aren't even in the flock now. Not a God of exclusivism, not a God of judgment, but a God of extreme welcome. Got it?
Got it.
So if that's God's message to portray here, that our calling is to follow that example, and we have two jobs. One, our church is called, first and foremost, to care for the sheep here. You are the little sheep. My job is to feed you spiritually. Your job is to kind of nudge each other back on the path. Our job together is to smack away the coyotes of greed and predators of selfishness and injustice and despair and guilt and all those nasty things that steal us from full life. And our second job, if God is a God of welcome and care, we are never to judge and bemoan the folks who are not here, but always to be open to grazing with the other sheep, and even more so to dream of how God might be taking care of them so that we might welcome them sometime in the future. We keep this up so that someday, we keep this thing up that we're doing here so that someday someone might come through those doors, or people who will never come through those doors, we go out the gate to reach them and to care for them. Our shape of this building, if it is to be shaped anything like Jesus' heart, is never to separate, never to smack people, but always to be open, always to care, always to love all people. Got it?
Yeah.
Amen.